Welcome back to your favourite podcast, everyone. A Foggy Day on Olympus is a place for occasionally grown-up discussions aimed at whomever we can lure in, and where we consider issues of history, religion, and culture and why they matter. My name is rumoured to be Mike Pierce.
Yes, and my name is Coal Campo, and today in our series on great 20th century writers that are too little read in the Anglosphere, we are looking at the extraordinary life and work of one of the greatest journalists and novelists of the interwar period.
Yes, Joseph Roth undoubtedly lived in cursed times, which he chronicled with brilliance and wry wit. And thanks to the exertions of his translator, Michael Hoffman, and a good recent biographer, Kieran Pym, he's coming back into prominence.
Right, and so we thought rather than focus on just one of his novels, we're looking at his output as a whole.
Yes, he's most famous for the Radetzky March, of which more in a few minutes. But that in itself might be too narrow a lens through which to look at his career as a whole.
So, on that rationale, would Why the Rest Hates the West be too narrow a lens to look at you?
After my long anticipated demise, you mean?
Well, if you insist.
Can we get back to
Yeah, sure, go on then.
Okay, right. So Roth was born in Brody, which is in the middle of the map here, in Austrian Galicia. At the time of his birth, the town had about 18,000 people, and about 3/4 of those were Jewish, as he was. And so it's often counted as a shtetl.
So, this town is now in present day Western Ukraine, right?
Yes, it was Austrian until the end of World War One, and then it was Poland between the wars. And then after Roth's death in May 39, it was invaded that September by the Soviet Union. And then it was invaded in June 41 by the Nazis, following which essentially all of the town's Jews were murdered. And then Soviet Union again after World War II.
So it's changed hands a few times, is what you're saying.
Quite a few times, yes.
Well, you better remind us again what a shtetl is.
Well, it's a Yiddish word that means just little town. It's very close to the German for the diminutive version of the word town. Because it's a Yiddish term, it's generally taken to designate a Jewish town, or mostly Jewish town, in East Central Europe. Yeah.
So we're thinking Fiddler on the Roof style.
Yes, that kind of a place. Well, here's his biography in brief. He's born in 1894 in Brody. He never knew his father, who'd abandoned his mother during her pregnancy. And he went to the University of Lemberg, which is Lviv to you and me, in 1913, but he moved to the University of Vienna in 1914.
Lemberg and Lviv, towns in Central and Eastern Europe, had multiple names then, and to an extent they still do.
Yes, less so nowadays. By the time the Jews have been killed off and the Germans driven out, and in this case the Poles driven out too, that's fewer variants of a town's name that are of much use, which is very sad. But even to this day, lots of towns do have multiple names. It's just that some of the variants are now very little used. So, for example, the German name for Zagreb is Agram, and that's rarely used now, and even most Germans wouldn't use it. Okay, so in 1916 to 18, he volunteered for the Austro-Hungarian army and he served on the Eastern Front.
Now, Austria-Hungary was fighting the Russian Empire in World War One.
Yes, it's part of the Central Powers. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire fighting the British, the French, and the Russians, and from 1915 the Italians, and from 1917 the Americans. Yeah. Although, I mean, Austro-Hungarian forces never came into contact with the British or the Americans or the French. It was the Russians and the Italians. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in 1919, after the end of the war, he succeeded in getting Austrian citizenship.
Right, and that's because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up after World War One. So if he'd just gone back home, he would have been living in the newly recreated Poland.
Yes. And that was not so appealing to him, I think. So he gets Austrian citizenship, and he's a journalist from the end of the war onwards, and indeed for the rest of his life. And from 1923, he worked for the Frankfurter Zeitung, mostly as a foreign correspondent.
So he's got Austrian citizenship now, but he's working for a German newspaper?
Yes. In fact, he's spending most of his time in Germany within a year of getting the Austrian citizenship. And as a foreign correspondent, he's gadding about all over the continent. And after 1933, he no longer lived in Germany after the rise of the Nazis, pretty obvious reason. And he was based in Paris.
I've been wondering if you sort of identify with him as a wandering vagabond.
Yes, I suppose I do really. Yes, don't really belong anywhere. Okay, so in 1922, he married the beautiful Friedel Reichler, who was from Vienna, but sadly, she developed schizophrenia in the late 1920s and had to be confined to a mental hospital. And she was murdered by the Nazis as part of their program of mercy killings.
So, did Roth stay in touch with her after she was hospitalized?
Not consistently, it was pretty occasional. And she died the year after he did. And it wasn't really known how and when she died until, only about 20 years ago, when researchers came across the records of where she had been.
Wow.
And now we know, well, not even the exact month, but it's June or July 1940. She was amongst a batch of mental patients to be murdered. Yes. Well, we're going to be looking at a number of his books, not all of them, there's a whole load, but at least some of them, and in roughly chronological order. This is his book, What I Saw, and it's a collection of his articles on Germany and particularly Berlin right after World War One. Now, like a lot of Europe, Berlin after the war was very volatile. This is something I think that particularly Americans and Brits don't realize. After World War One, America could go back to normal, and even Britain could to an extent because it hadn't been fought in. France, again, to some extent, I mean, the northeast of the country was devastated, but the rest of it wasn't. But for the rest of the continent, things were much harder and people were really, really hungry after the war. And across large swathes of the continent, fighting continued for up to another 5 years. We may not call it World War One, it was more local conflicts. So Germany was very volatile.
And we'll be covering a lot more about this in a series that we're hoping to call The Impact of World War One sometime around the end of this year.
Yes, that's right. Well, this piece is taken from an article about a shelter for the homeless. So, naked iron bedsteads, wire mesh beds for penance. Every homeless person is given a thin blanket of papery stuff, which admittedly is clean and disinfected. And on these beds, they sit and sleep and lie, the homeless people, grotesque-looking figures as though hauled from the lower depths of world literature. 100 of them to a room. Women, grown men, and youths kept apart. Roughly half have sexually transmitted diseases, because again, one thing we need to remember is that during war's time, standards tend to slip, and so there tend to be these kinds of epidemics. The majority have lice. It's difficult to persuade them to get cleaned up. Their clothes don't survive disinfection. They'd rather go around with their lice intact than look still more ragged than they do already.
I think this is something else too that we often forget. Like you said, in America, we don't really think about the long lasting effects of this, but these people must have felt like their lives were over. How do you really come back from that, emotionally and psychologically?
Yes, and lots of people were stateless or destitute, and the people described in this particular article are actually homeless.
Right.
Right? Obviously, that wasn't the majority, but plenty of people were. So, yeah, that was a big problem. For years after the war, millions of stateless people.
Yeah, because the borders have all been changed around, and so it's probably unclear whose responsibility these people are.
Right, yeah, the states that they were born in, including those for Roth himself, no longer exist.
Right.
So they could just go back to where they're from and find out what country they're in now. Or they could go somewhere where they might feel their ethnicity is at least going to be in the majority or something like that.
Right.
Okay, well, just a few pictures, but we'll cover this subject a lot more. In fact, we'll give Germany after World War I a whole episode when we do our projected series late this year on the aftermath of World War I. But just to give you a flavour of it, here's a poster encouraging people to join up with a Freikorps. So it says, protect the homeland. And we've got this threatening claw coming from the east. Join up with the Freikorps of General Commando Ludwitz or the Border Protection East.
So people are really, really afraid that the Bolshevik Revolution will spread from Russia to their country.
Yes, 1919 was the year of the Red Scare, even in America, actually. In Britain, too, especially on the Clyde side in Scotland, but far more so in Germany and much of Central Europe. Yeah. In fact, there was an attempted communist coup. This shows smashed grocery windows in Hungary, Berlin in 1919. One of the big reasons why Germany had simply folded in 1918 was that it was so hungry. The British had been blockading it for all of World War I using their naval forces, and that didn't have so much of an effect whilst Austro-Hungary was still in the fight, and whilst there were territories in the east from which Germany could get food supplies. But once that was all kind of starting to be played out and Russia was collapsing into Red Revolution, well, that wasn't really possible. And so people back home were hungry. And the blockade was not given up in the immediate aftermath of the war until Germany had signed the peace treaty that they hated so much. So, yeah, Germany was in a volatile state. This shows armed workers and soldiers taking part in a revolt in early 1919, and the same with this picture here.
So these are the Spartakists who rebelled in early 1919.
Yes, they're taking their name, of course, from Spartacus, the leader of the biggest slave revolt in ancient Rome. They were, in fact, communists. Well, we're not going to pursue that one now, but Roth certainly gives a load of articles about Germany in the aftermath of the Great War. This is another collection of his essays here, The Wandering Jews. And he describes the condition that Jews are living in and what their mentality is like, particularly those he calls the Ostjuden, the Eastern Jews. not the Western assimilated ones, but those who are coming, as he had done, from the eastern parts of the Austrian Empire, or perhaps were fleeing Russia and moving into Germany to get away from the fighting, perhaps to get away from communism, perhaps to get away from Polish anti Semitism, and coming to places like Berlin. And they were not at all like the cultured, assimilated, highly educated Jews of Western Europe. Well, the articles are just brilliant, but I thought it would be perhaps most enlightening in telling us about Roth himself to just give a little section here from his own introduction. This book is not interested in the plaudits and endorsements, much less the cavils and criticisms of those who despise, hate, and persecute the East European Jews. It does not address itself to those Western Europeans who, by virtue of the fact they grew up with elevators and flush toilets, allow themselves to make bad jokes about Romanian lice, Galician cockroaches, or Russian fleas. This book is not interested in those objective readers who, out of sheer humanity, are struck with pity at inadequate sewage systems and whose fear of contagion leads them to lock up poor immigrants in tenements where social problems are solved by simple epidemics. Ouch. This book does not want to be read by those who would seek to deny their own fathers or forefathers if they happen to escape from such tenements. So he's actually taking a potshot at his fellow Jews here, who might look at the arrival of their co-religionists from the East and want to say, oh, well, they're nothing to do with us. So for whom is this book? The author has the fond hope that there may still be readers from whom the Eastern Jews do not require protection. Western Europeans who are not merely proud of their clean mattresses. These are readers who've already perceived that these visitors from the East are not just pickpockets. This book will only try to describe the human beings who constitute the problem and the circumstances that cause it.
Wow, that may be the most feisty, combative author's introduction that I've ever read. I mean, not even you would punch your readers on the nose quite that hard.
Well, he's aware of the strong prejudice against Ostjuden, and not just among Gentiles, but among Western assimilated Jews. And Roth is himself an Ostjude.
So he's taking no prisoners.
Right, right. And there was indeed serious trouble in and around these groups of people. I mean, people didn't like them arriving. So we've got a picture here of the beginnings of a scuffle, I think. The influx of Ostjuden Jews from the East. It's the trigger for anti Semitic riots and murders. And of course, it was a gift to anti Semitic politicians because Hitler and indeed his ilk were just starting to get their act together, forming their, at that stage, still microscopic little political parties with all kinds of pompous names. But nevertheless, over the next few years, they will become a much, much more serious threat. Yeah.
So we can already see the rise of Nazism on the distant horizon.
Right. Okay, well, staying with collections of essays, this one, I have to admit, is my personal favorite, The Hotel Years. And it's called that because he spent his life living in hotels because he was traveling around for the Frankfurter Zeitung, visiting a whole load of different countries and sending back little reports about what life was like there. And his descriptions are absolutely brilliant. There's a fairly random little quotation, which is kind of hilarious about the kind of person who's the doorman in loads of formal hotels. When I leave the hotel, the porter stands beside the revolving door, primed to greet me like a talking fork. He has an absolutely poisonous turn of phrase. I love it.
And admire it, I dare say.
Yes, yes, I would seek to emulate it if I could.
Yeah.
Okay, well, one of the best bits is his reporting from Albania. And Albania was then, as indeed it is now, one of the very poorest and most backward countries in Europe. And his descriptions are pretty merciless. So he goes there in June 1927.
So this is a picture here of Roth in Albanian costume.
Yes, he's having a laugh at the expense of the locals. So they're getting off the boat. He and whoever's traveling with him. He says, there are only two of us disembarking here. A man hoping in this land of beards to sell Gillette razors, and myself. The hut, like many attractions these days, has a guest book. Sitting over the book is a man in a black uniform rolling himself a cigarette. And this is the Albanian border police. A master of the alphabet, but unused to writing.
He's making fun of this guy, isn't he? He means he only pretends to be literate.
Yes, exactly, yes. He sits there whiling away the time of the new arrivals by painstaking scrutiny of their passports. I cut short his study by offering to set down my name for him. In reading that there, I'm reminded of when I first applied for a driving license in Western New York and went to this little burg that had, what's it called? Anyway, the driving license center, and handed over my passport. And this woman, without any exaggeration at all, spent 15 to 20 minutes just staring at it. I don't think she'd ever encountered even an American passport before, let alone a foreign one. There we are. Okay. Then, in a dense cloud of dust, amid the thunder of continually exploding tyres thrown up and down by authentic Ford Springs, I'm taken along the road to Tirana.
What is authentic Ford Springs supposed to mean?
Well, he's mocking the local self-defensiveness. So they're going to be trying to assure him of how everything is like up to date and all this kind of thing. And it has authentic Ford Springs. Like who looks at the springs inside a car? But yeah, that's what's going on here. And he's just mocking it. Each time a tire needs changing, I get out, watch the dust settle, and the scenery re-establish itself. Workmen are repairing the road. There are always two hunched over together, and like children in kindergarten, they collect little scoops of sand on their tiny shovels or in their bare hands, pour it into scars and potholes, sprinkle a few stones on top, wet the whole thing with water from a watering can, and stamp it down with their bare feet.
So basically, the whole place sounds like a disaster.
Yes, and he is enjoying letting us know with his vivid descriptions. So here is Tirana, the capital city of Albania. On the right, a mosque. On the left, a rudimentary cafe terrace where guests bake and fezzes talk. Good citizens walk down the middle of the road, armed with muskets against sunstroke.
So he's having a good laugh here.
Yeah, it sounds like Texas, though, doesn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
Heavy drum revolvers stuck in wide, often doubled and tripled red sashes. A man turns up by the name of Nicola, who lets me a room. The bed has all four legs in petrol to keep the cockroaches at bay. The window is cracked at the bottom and replaced at the top by a mosquito net. My neighbour is a trumpeter. A policeman with snow white gloves stands in the middle of the road in case of traffic.
Oh my gosh, this guy is merciless.
Well, it's the old joke, still applicable in many places today. The white gloves are an outward token of modernity, cleanliness, and efficiency, tossed in the hope that they'll somehow outweigh the evidence of your eyes and ears. This reminded me of my first time in Romania, not long out of communism. And I went there with my daughter Bethan, who was just 11 at the time. And we were traveling around. There's a whole load of hilarious stories to tell about that, but there's just one I want to focus on here because it relates to this. A former student of mine in London a few years earlier was now faculty member in the college where I would be delivering my lecture. All too aware of the shortcomings of his country's infrastructure, he'd taken the precaution of booking Bethan and me into what he assured us was, quote, the best hotel in town. And to this day, there is not a doubt in my mind that it was indeed the best. It was completely frightful. Dingy, cavernous, with faded furnishings that appeared to have been untouched for decades, we were among very few guests. Even walking its corridors was distinctly creepy. At least the bed linen was clean, the room as a whole more dubious, and then there was the bathroom. The sharp smell in our bathroom in Oradea was not amenable to being easily fixed. It penetrated the entire suite. The toilet seat was encircled by one of those disposable paper tapes bearing a logo that said, guaranteed to have been sanitized, or something of the sort. I still speak no Romanian, but for signs one hardly needs to. I'd taken Latin and Italian all the way to inglorious O-level failure decades before, and French to the lowest possible passing grade. From this veritable encyclopedia of linguistic erudition, the gist of Romanian signs was not difficult to figure out, especially when they were placed above a toilet bowl. These tapes always have the opposite effect upon me of their stated intent. Transparently an arse covering exercise, that's probably the wrong expression here. Well, in the first place, the only countries where you find them are those where the presumption is that hotel toilet seats are unsanitary. They're a kind of confirmation, if one were needed, that you are in an unclean land. In the second place, a moment's reflection as to how the tape was actually put there by some poor, half-starved chambermaid makes it plain that some unsanitary actions had been entered into in the very act of giving you, the guest, the assurance. We're not done. But the pièce de résistance in our room was the toilet bowl itself. It had a roughly diamond-shaped hole all the way through, situated in the front about halfway between the rim and the surface of the water beneath, from which cracks emanated in 4 directions. For the duration of our stay, strategic peeing was to be the order of the day. Still, at least the seat was clean, if you're inclined to believe in that sort of thing. Okay, then there was breakfast the following morning. With the important exception of our stay with the friends in Timișoara, the food in Romania had been terrible. Even the bread was barely edible in those days. So as we perused the grubby menu, we were in something of a quandary. The waiter was very kind. Seeing our consternation, he talked to us in English for a minute or two, trying to extract a description of something that the kitchen staff could fix and that we could actually eat. Brackets. In retrospect, the poor man need hardly have bothered. My daughter would puke up her breakfast on the station platform an hour later. It was while he was gone on his errand of mercy that Bethan, with earnest face, asked me the question that reduced me to hysterics. A question had formulated itself in her mind. Daddy, she leaned forward, reducing her voice to a whisper. if this hotel were in England, how many stars would it be? There was a pause while the paternal unit temporarily disintegrated. After it had composed itself, it hissed back between splutters, "Darling, if this place were in England, it would have been closed down by the authorities decades ago." So, yes.
So this is all very funny what Roth is writing here, but isn't it a teeny bit of a discrepancy between all of this cruel wit, but then his angry defense of Eastern Jews? I mean, there he was all give these guys a break, you snobbish, cushy Westerners, but here he's openly mocking of his inferiors.
There are very, very few constants in human history. The platitudes of beauty queens notwithstanding, all people everywhere really want the same things. No. But this is one of them. There are some constants, and this is one of them. To be indignantly egalitarian from one's own socio-economic level upwards, and sneering and condescending, or just maintaining standards or upholding order from one's own level downwards. You get it in politics, including church politics and social life. You see it in this part of the world right now. We are just as good as the Germans and contemptuous of whichever hapless ethnic group are to our south or east.
Right.
And Roth's doing it. Concerning the Ostjuden, well, jokes about Galician lice and Russian fleas are out of bounds, but the guest house bedroom in Tirana gets the full description.
You know, I feel like this may be the first morally improving point that you've made in these podcasts.
Yes, yeah, I'm not really very heavily into moral improvement, am I?
Clearly.
Clearly. Oh, what am I doing in this company?
Right.
Okay, so, well, maybe it's time to think then about Roth's changing politics. As a student in Vienna, he was a socialist and during the early war years, a pacifist. But the return of friends who'd been injured at the front made him ashamed, and he eventually joined the army, although that was more because he hoped the experience might improve his writing than from belief in the cause. And he remained a leftist in the immediate post war years, but he metamorphosed slowly into a conservative. And a visit to the Soviet Union in 1926 was a turning point for him. And the rise of Nazism, obviously, was another. And his 1932 masterpiece, The Radetzky March, and its 1938 sequel, The Emperor's Tomb, are a lament for the destroyed Austro-Hungarian Empire that had maintained tolerance and social peace for such a long time.
This sounds like kind of the usual pattern, this journey from youthful leftist to a middle aged, cranky conservative.
Maybe, but turbocharged, I think, in his case. He was living at a time when conservatism was becoming increasingly impossible. The old order lay in ruins after 1918, and the new world, in continental Europe at least, was dominated by competing brands of radicalism. Democracy, or something like it, had been erected on the ruins of the old world, except in the Soviet Union, of course, and yet it was not strong enough to survive. No, pretty much all of the states, particularly the new states, collapsed into dictatorship of one kind or another, usually authoritarian right wing, and in a number of cases, of course, outright fascistic. And Roth could see that put all kinds of people in danger, including people like himself.
Hmm. Right. And with conservatism becoming increasingly impossible, it sounds worryingly like today.
Disturbingly like today. Yes. Yes. Well, in 1926, he traveled to Moscow, Kiev, and Odessa. And Walter Benjamin, a German Jewish Marxist philosopher who spent time with him in Moscow and, of course, thought the Soviet Union was wonderful, he noted grumpily that he had come to Russia as a nearly confirmed Bolshevik and was leaving it a royalist.
Well, now a lot of Jews had taken refuge in communism, as Benjamin had, as at least it was offering safety for themselves.
Right, but precisely that fact exposed them to the ire of emergent fascist movements who could say communism is driven by the Jews, so it could feed into anti Semitism. It put a powerful rhetorical weapon in their hands. And in any case, Roth could see that communism was wrong in itself. He was impressed by progress in literacy there, for example, but he wasn't blind to the oppression entailed in the Soviet system.
Right.
And he himself says in a letter to a friend in 1932, my strongest experience was the war and the destruction of my fatherland, the only one I ever had, the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary.
So he's feeling homesick for a home that no longer exists.
Hence the endless flight. And what we've got in this map here is Austria-Hungary superimposed on a map with modern borders. So the grey lines there are the boundaries that obtain today. Right. So these are broadly similar, at least in a number of respects, to states created after World War One. So Austria-Hungary was torn into many pieces. Austria and Hungary were reduced to small states, which they still are. Czechoslovakia was created to the north. Galicia, Austrian Galicia, was given to a recreated Poland. Transylvania and a lot of Banat were given to Romania. The South Tyrol was given to Italy, and the other lands to the south, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Vojvodina, given to the new kingdom that would eventually be called Yugoslavia. So, yeah, it's just ripped into a whole load of pieces. Okay, well, let's come to his most famous novel, The Radetzky March. And it's published in 1932. It tells the story of a junior lieutenant, Trotter, who saves the life of the young Emperor Franz Joseph. This incident didn't really happen, but it's just made up to create the story. At the Battle of Solferino in 1859, and he's rewarded with a noble title and a permanent pension. So the novel continues with the life of Trotter's son and grandson down to their ruin, along with the end of the empire in the Great War.
So his greatest novel is the classic literary device of exploring a macro theme, or in other words, the collapse of an empire, through the microcosm of a single family.
Yes, that's what's going on there. Yeah. And we have a passage here from the novel. That's Emperor Franz Joseph in his older days there. This era no longer wants us. This era wants to create independent nation states. People no longer believe in God. The new religion is nationalism. Just a reminder that nationalism in the 19th century, and indeed up to and including the First World War, was generally a secular force. Right? Nations no longer go to church, they go to national associations. The monarchy, our monarchy, is founded on piety, on the faith that God chose the Habsburgs to rule over so and so many Christian peoples. Our emperor is a secular brother of the Pope. He is his imperial and royal apostolic majesty. No other is as apostolic. No other majesty in Europe is as dependent on the grace of God and on the faith of the peoples in the grace of God.
So nationalism and secularism go hand in hand.
Yeah, that had been the pattern of pre-Great War nationalism, which is what fatally undermined the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
For which you can see episode 3 of our series on secularization.
Indeed, please do. Well, the sequel to this is The Emperor's Tomb. Neither of these novels is very long. The Emperor's Tomb is particularly short. And just a couple of little quotations from that to give us something of the flavour. It wasn't till much later, long after the Great War, which people call the World War, and in my view, rightly, and not for the usual reason that the whole world was involved in it, but rather because, as a result of it, we lost the whole world, our world. My former home, the monarchy, was a large house with many doors and many rooms for many different kinds of people. Think of the map that we just looked at. This house has been divided, broken up, ruined. I have no business with what is there now. I'm used to living in a house, not in cabins.
So, Austria Hungary had been broken up into 3 countries: Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, with large chunks of territory given to 4 other countries.
Only 2 of which had even existed before the war.
Right. So there are now international frontiers crossing every railway line and main road and every trade route.
Right, which cut off a lot more than just producers from their suppliers and their customers. It caused people's entire worlds to become suddenly boxed in.
Right.
Well, Roth's life badly needed a decent biography in English. And just about 3 years ago, it finally got one. Kieran Pym's book in 2022, Endless Flight, which is taking its cue from one of Roth's stories, Flight Without End. God was, for Roth, like Franz Josef had been, as Pym says, our Father who art in heaven, the paternal protector who ruled over the vanished fatherland of his, Roth's, vanished childhood. He was not convinced that any of these could be found, but knew that the search granted direction to his life. At least he knew he was not only fleeing, but pursuing, not only pushed by persecutors, but pushing his life's course, regaining control. Although he didn't really get control.
Right. So the idea of the biography is that Roth is spending the rest of his life running, looking for somewhere that he belongs and not really finding anywhere.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And Endless Flight sums that up so well, we've made that the title of this episode. So Roth was, in fact, a chronic alcoholic. When he died in May 39, his liver was swollen to monstrous size. It was pretty disgusting, actually. Would he have become an alcoholic without this trauma, without having a wife who was seriously mentally ill, the fact that he constantly felt his life was being threatened, felt that he didn't belong anywhere? Quite possibly he would. I mean, I don't think we can know. But he was certainly far from an ideal character in this respect. And he was far from ideal, too, in the way that he treated some of the people who helped him. And in this respect, it's worth taking a moment to look at Stefan Zweig. Now, Zweig was also Jewish, but he came from the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born to a wealthy family in Vienna, and after the war, he became one of the most popular writers in the German language in the 1920s and early 1930s. So he was prolific and popular, although Roth's translator, Michael Hoffman, doesn't like him at all. He says that Zweig's stuff was saccharine and trashy, a sort of literary Pepsi Cola, which is kind of mean.
Yeah. Now, this guy was a good friend to Roth, though, but Roth treated him really pretty badly in return.
Yes, this is Roth at his least admirable. Was constantly lending Roth money because he was always short. He was pretty well paid by journalistic standards, but he managed to burn through a whole lot of money, helped by his drinking habit. And Roth was pretty mean and ungrateful to him. I mean, it is very similar behavior to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, actually. Not that Rousseau was an alcoholic, but that all of the people who helped him, he was absolutely spiteful to in return. And Roth is behaving a little like this. Yeah, not really very nice. But Zweig was, whether or not one agrees with Hoffmann's negative appraisal of his literary skills, the public thought otherwise, he was a fairly gentle soul, but he was also tragic. Roth did warn him once Hitler seized power in early 1933 of what was coming. He says, "You will have realized by now that we are drifting towards great catastrophes. Apart from the private, our literary and financial existence is destroyed. It all leads to a new war. I won't bet a penny on our lives. They've succeeded in establishing a reign of barbarity. Do not fool yourself. Hell reigns."
Now, that's pretty prophetic, or clear sighted at least, because most people were far more complacent.
Yeah, they were. Lots of people thought that Hitler could be managed, or that he didn't mean what he said, and that somehow catastrophe could be avoided. And of course, they were wrong. The siren voices were very few, but Roth could see quite clearly. And of course, what he said was indeed borne out by events. And indeed, pretty soon, this picture here is from May 33, when the Nazis had been in power just for a couple of months. There are public book burnings, like this one at Opera Square in Berlin, destroying works by Jewish authors, including Zweig's. This man who had been one of the most popular authors in the country. And in 1934, Zweig emigrated to England. And in 1940, with Britain looking to be in serious danger in the early phases of the Second World War, he decided that he hadn't fled far enough. So he crossed the Atlantic and went to New York, stayed there very briefly, and went on to Brazil, which he really liked. But in February 1942, in despair at the utter ruination of Europe and its culture, he and his wife committed suicide.
Which is not just sad, but a little ironic to commit suicide just then. I mean, the war was just about at its turning point.
Yes, it is extremely tragic. He just thought that the Nazis are going to win, everything's completely ruined. So they were full of despair. And his final book, The World of Yesterday, was an autobiography, but it was also a panegyric, a paean to Europe before the Great War, a world of tolerant, multi-ethnic empires and freedom, which the outcome of the Great War had made impossible. Well, I've said we can't mention all of Roth's books, but this one should be mentioned as well. It's another collection of his articles on the end of the world, and they're raging against the Nazis. Sadly, and I persevered right through this book, I have to say that it has to be his worst book.
And why exactly do you think it's his worst?
Because it's simply endless bitter language and sarcasm. But sarcasm, when it's kept up, just sounds empty in the end. I mean, we hear this kind of stuff sometimes from Russian official sources when Westerners are complaining about the terrible things that are being done in Ukraine and so on. And it just sounds completely empty and unpersuasive. Well, with the Nazis, you've got a pretty big target there to attack. You really should sound persuasive. So if you're not sounding persuasive even against that, But I think he's just so carried away by entirely understandable and entirely justifiable venom
Right.
that the pieces just don't work
Yep.
somehow. Others may disagree, but that was certainly my feeling, not just about one piece, but about the work as a whole. We will look at one of the better excerpts from it now, though, because he saw nationalism as killing culture, not defending it. You could say, he said, that patriotism has killed Europe. Patriotism is particularism. However, European culture goes back much further than the nations of Europe. Greece, Rome and Israel, Christendom and Renaissance, the French Revolution and Germany's 18th century, the supranational music of Austria and Slavic poetry. These are the forces that have sculpted the face of Europe. All these forces have forged European solidarity and the European cultural consciousness. None of these forces know national boundaries. All are the enemies of that barbarian power, so-called national pride. Well, we might want to quibble with that, particularly in the case of the French Revolution, which is generally taken by historians as giving rise to modern nationalism. But I know what his rejoinder would be, and so do you. The French Revolution spread everywhere, and its ideals spread all over the place. But nationalists of that period still like to think, that the great cultural artifacts produced within their societies are somehow exclusively theirs. But that's mostly false. Shakespeare and Goethe may have extended the possibilities of the English and German languages, but their works are nevertheless the products of a larger culture that belongs to Europe as a whole, or in their cases at least to the West.
Right.
By insisting on specificity, culture is made something dead, and the Nazis, in banning works by Jews, outlawed a huge portion of European literature, particularly in the German language, right? And music and so on. So, yeah. All right. Well, to finish up here, then, what about Roth and religious belief? For a person who practiced that most modern and secular of professions, a journalist, and was not particularly moral, as we've seen, Roth wasn't at all dismissive of religion. He said, I don't believe that man can save man, which was a pretty sound observation, given that he was looking at high modernism and the disaster it was wreaking. I'm a believer, and as such, I believe that man can only be saved through heaven. If one believes that man can be saved by man, one is ripe for communism or for National Socialism, Nazism. He had a deep respect for Catholicism, perhaps, we might suspect, because he saw it as the governing rationale for the Habsburg Empire that had guaranteed safety for its inhabitants. And it's suspected that he actually converted near the end of his life.
So we could say that he saw religion as underpinning a moral society in a world that had lost its moral moorings, and Catholicism in particular as the glue that held the different peoples of Central Europe together.
I think that's what's going on in his mind. Yes. Yes.
Right.
Well, okay, we've covered a number of his works here, and to guard against the danger of having any money or bookshelf space left, freeze this video now and take notes.
Is this his full collection that you have here?
No. I think I will probably leave it where it is now. I think I'm not likely to read yet more of him. There's a fair sprinkling of stuff there, along with the biography of him by Kieran Pym and a couple of the works by Stefan Zweig that we mentioned as well.
Yeah. Somebody could call this fangirl status, you know.
Yeah, you could do, I suppose. He is awfully good.
Right. Now, okay, so next week we're going to be heading further east and considering a novel that's so important that more than 60 years after its author's death, it is finally recognized as a sort of latter day War and Peace.
Yes, and this is Vasily Grossman's life and fate spun around the turning point of World War II and its biggest battle, Stalingrad, where Grossman was a Soviet war reporter. So that's going to conclude our series next week. So do please join us for that.
Yes, and if you enjoyed this video in particular, we kindly, without begging, ask you to repost it to your social media and bother all your friends with it so that they can pick up some new reading material themselves.
Not on your hands and knees like last week.
No, not this time.
Okay, okay. All right, that's fair enough. Yes, please repost to social media and subscribe, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Bye bye now, everybody.
Bye, everyone.